It's always great to see you. Thanks for taking the time. How could we be giving kids puberty blockers for 20 years?
I know this is very troubling. The report is very clear that children and young people have been badly let down and have been receiving treatment that's not based on evidence. So I think the Cass review is really important. We welcome it. Labour accepts all of its recommendations. I think they should be implemented now as swiftly as possible, and we would like to work with the government on doing that.
And what would you like to say to those doctors, clinicians, who felt that they couldn't speak out because if they did, they would be victimised?
Well, I hope that this report really is a watershed moment for the NHS, for NHS gender services, because this is, the report's clear, it's basically talking about evidence, focusing on children's welfare and not having all of this get caught up in culture wars or in different kinds of those debates. Instead, be able to just put the child at the centre of the support that the NHS should give them. As I think your report said, looking at wider issues around mental health, looking at the wider issues and concerns that children and young people are raising. There have already been changes made around, as a result of the interim report, around stopping the use of puberty blockers on the NHS for children. I think there is a further issue that the report flags, but I think the government hasn't responded on yet about what happens around private prescriptions. I think that's important to be looked at because this was a recommendation on safety grounds as well. But look, overall, we think this is a very serious and an important report, and I hope everybody will welcome its recommendations and now work to put them into practice.
A final thought on that, Shadow Home Secretary. In your opinion, should children be able to socially transition without their parents' permission?
Well, parents obviously need to be involved in something like this. It's so important, and so of course parents should be involved. Again, I think there have been changes now to the guidance on this for schools. But again, I think this is something where, look, everybody, whether it's parents, children, clinicians, everybody should just want the child's welfare to be put at the heart of this and to make sure that they've got the support that they need.
Now, I know you want to talk to us this morning about breathing new life into the high street. How are you going to do that if you win?
So we know our town centres have been really hard hit, whether that's because you don't see the police anymore. We've had a big 30% increase in shoplifting, antisocial behaviour in our town centres, or the fact that small shops have been heavily hit, a lot of empty shops, businesses pulling out. So the things that we're saying Labour would do is to support our local small businesses, to scrap and replace business rates that do hit high streets really hard, to also make sure that you've got banking hubs to bring banking services back into town centres, and neighbourhood police, community police back in our town centres, stronger action against shoplifting and assaults on shop workers. But it's those bobbies on the beat, 13,000 more PCSOs and police officers in our neighbourhood teams under Labour's plan.
What are you making of our report this morning on the programme, Shadow Home Secretary, suggesting that a man who had been convicted of a sex offence actually spent time in jail, was still allowed to stay in the United Kingdom, even though he initially lost his appeal to do that, because if he went back to, in this case, Afghanistan, his life could be in danger?
Well, I think there's a series of problems in the asylum system. We've got a lot of chaos in the asylum system now, with huge long delays, a complete lack of enforcement, and standards have to be upheld as part of the asylum system. So we had some of these issues raised around the awful Azedi case as well, which is somebody who clearly should not have been allowed to stay in the country. So I do think there has to be a strong, not just a strong decision-making around where somebody has committed a serious offence, then they should not be granted asylum in the UK, but also to make sure that there is proper enforcement in place. And that's why Labour is putting forward a proposal for a new strong returns and enforcement unit, because we've seen the number of returns for those failed cases has plummeted under the Conservatives over the last 14 years.
Would there ever be a case where Labour, if it was in power, would allow a sex offender to stay in the United Kingdom?
Well, at the moment, I actually think that the rules need to be stronger around sex offenders, because those, I think, are not being treated at the moment as serious enough offences. You know, there is a framework around making sure that serious offenders actually should not be granted asylum, but I don't think that that takes seriously enough some of the issues around sexual offences. So that is an area where we think much more needs to be done. But you also need to actually then make sure that there is enforcement, because if there's such long delays, then you can end up with the system unravelling and being in chaos. Whereas if you have proper early enforcement, which is what should have happened in the Azedi case, then you actually make sure that those returns happen in the first place. Look, we have a long-standing system and issue in this country about giving sanctuary to those who have fled persecution and conflict. But standards need to be maintained, and that means where people don't have a right to be in the UK, there has to be a proper enforcement system in place as well. And that's not working at the moment. There's just too much chaos in the system.
Bishop of Dover on the programme this morning, reacting and reflecting on what she's heard from the Home Secretary, who is very critical of some asylum seekers being allowed to convert to Christianity, critical of the church and some clerics as a result. She says, we don't convert people, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. What's your reaction to that?
Whether there just has to be proper systems in place to make sure that the system's not being abused, to make sure that people aren't being exploited as part of this. So, you know, I think part of the problem, look, is the Home Office is not taking proper decisions. There's a huge backlog. They then end up taking some decisions in a chaotic rush because of the huge backlog. We've got huge numbers of people in asylum hotels, which is costing the taxpayer billions of pounds. I think there's been too much focus on gimmick rather than getting a grip of the system. We need a fair, properly controlled and managed asylum system. You've got to have strong border security and also a fair, controlled and managed asylum system so that those who have fled persecution get support, but also standards are met, and those who don't have a right to be in the UK are properly returned and the enforcement is in place. And, you know, I think too often there's just been this focus from the Conservatives on the gimmicks rather than getting a grip, and that's what we need.
OK, before I let you go, I know you're a strong advocate for women's rights. Should Labour give the £2 million a year or thereabouts that's donated by, and in other ways as well, by the GMB union, should they give that back? Should you give that back, given the report into the situation there where it suggests that sexism is rife still within that union?
I think there's some very serious issues have been raised. My understanding is that those are being investigated in terms of what the issues are within the GMB union. Look, of course, the GMB union is part of, represents members right across the country, represents huge numbers of women right across the country, and is an important part of the Labour movement. And that's why those issues need to be addressed by the investigation that, as I understand it, is underway.
OK, and if that's proven to be the case, the money should be given back?
No, the GMB is an important part of the Labour Party, of the Labour movement, and has been for a very long time. But there have been some very serious issues raised, and it's really important that those are investigated and taken seriously.
And you'll keep the money?
The GMB is long-standing. It represents huge numbers of people across the country. The most important thing is that any issues or concerns that has actually properly got to the bottom of, and that investigation takes place. So I take this very seriously. I'm a GMB member myself. I think this is really serious that any of those concerns are investigated.
But you appreciate the duplicitousness of saying we're not going to give the money back, but we want Tory donors to give their money back when they misstep.
No, I think the issue is we've still got this investigation underway, and this is a major institution that represents people right across the country who need proper representation. We see in workplaces across the country where there is exploitation that takes place, where there are problems around lack of fair pay agreements in place, and unions, including the GMB, rightly do really important work supporting their members and standing up for their members. And it's working people, and the trade union movement is what led to the founding of the Labour Party in the first place. So that's an important part of our structures. But within that, that's why it's so important that we understand exactly what's happened here, and that there is
I understand that,
investigation.
Shadow Home Secretary, but my point, which I tried to just challenge you on a few moments ago, was should you give the money back if it's found that there is sexism that is rife within the GMB union?
I think what's important, and I say this as a member of the GMB union, I think what's really important is that action is taken to tackle any problems and that the investigation has taken place. But we, as you know, we've not seen, I think that investigation is underway. I think there's an independent KC who has been appointed to look at this, as I understand it. And it's really important that they should do that and also make sure that any action that needs to change does so.
OK, it's always great to see you. Thanks for taking the time.